Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research. And as we'll explore in this episode, the burgeoning institutionalization of psychedelics as a for-profit industry. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Today, we feature Alexander Beiner. Beiner is co-founder of Rebel Wisdom, a media platform and community focused on having nuanced conversations about complex ideas in culture, personal development, and philosophy. He's also the director of Breaking Convention, Europe's largest conference on psychedelic culture and medicine, of which I was lucky enough to present at in 2019. A link to that will be contained in the description to this episode. Back to Alexander. Beiner has also been involved in psychedelic activism for the last 15 years and is particularly interested in how psychedelics are entering the mainstream. Recently, he released a film through Rebel Wisdom called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism, where he, quote, speaks to leading experts in the field, from clinicians and CEOs to shamans and philosophers, to ask what the rise of psychedelic capitalism means for the future of culture and medicine. Alexander Beiner joins us on Adventures Through the Mind today to discuss the rise of psychedelic capitalism, its impact on the culture, and the risk of us losing something promising if we get swept up by the various narratives for-profit models are seeding into our minds. We also discuss Western culture's crisis of meaning, the dissolution of trust in institutions, the Internet of Beefs, and the challenge of sensemaking in our modern technological and informational landscape. Before we get into this episode, big thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode wherever you happen to be catching it. Patrons, without you, this podcast would not exist. Thank you. If you listening are not yet a patron and you are enjoying the show, please consider becoming a patron by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. There you can pledge to offer me per month even the amount of just a cup of coffee. And in doing so, you join a community of people who help me continue to work full-time in the production of this podcast. If a monthly pledge is not where you're at just now, that's cool. You can give a one-time donation through PayPal or cryptocurrency as well, and links to doing so are contained in the description to this episode. Okay, so here's my interview with Alexander Beiner of Rebel Wisdom discussing the rise of psychedelic capitalism, Adventures Through the Mind, episode 137. Enjoy. Is it working?
No, now it's working. There we go. Amazing.
I was just having a moment.
Good.
I've been reading a book by a woman her whole book is about attention, and it follows her journey of becoming addicted to Adderall. And as we're both like fidgeting with how to make it work, I wondered what David Foster Wallace, how he would feel about the amount of attention we put to trying to make our devices work so that we could put our attention towards our desired thing. Like every time.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, it's like a little, there's a certain like demand of modern devices, like even the beeping of like our dishwasher that says it's done. Mm-hmm. It's such a strange dynamic with that, I think, of like sort of the demand from a machine to act and pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. I find that quite a disturbing thing. It's just sort of like it is taking attention in space.
I was going to say one of the comments, I just discovered this woman, Casey something, accidentally. It's one of those things where I was looking up one thing, which led to finding another thing, which led to seeing this podcast. I was like, oh, maybe this is interesting. And then forgetting it existed, and then just being bored and scrolling through my podcast list and being like, oh, what's this? But one of the things she had said was coming out on the other side of her Adderall addiction after a decade, realizing that the world had now the demands and expectations of the world as a writer and as a person existing in a technologically switched on world seems to make it as though everybody has an attention deficit disorder, which means everyone is ready for the Adderall cure if they want to keep up with the way that our modern world has scattered our minds and the expectations it has on and unrealistic expectations it has on most people's natural intelligence, and how it damages that attention, not intelligence.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know about Adderall so much, but like modafinil really has the effect of, it's really not addictive, but it does certainly have the effect of reducing empathy. Like there's different modes. There's, I mean, it's like a high vigilance, like highly like aroused in the scientific sense mode isn't one of particular empathy towards other people on the kind of softer human level. It strikes me that that's kind of like culturally embedded in tech anyway, like in the technology platforms. And so it's like, different drugs serving different eras. It's certainly an Adderall era, isn't it? But how, I mean, it's not that pleasurable, is it? I've never really taken it, but it's kind of,
I love how much of whatever my deep wounds are, like I have these wounds around worth and adequacy and all these things are deeply embedded in me, or sort of deeply seated in me, that express themselves in all these different ways. And it all happens to focus around my ability to attend to, be adequate for the pursuit of and accomplishment of meaningful goals. And when I take something like Dexedrine, for example, which is euphoric in its own right, fair enough, but even Vyvanse, which isn't necessarily euphoric, there's something to it, which is like, oh yeah, it gives me that ability to do that. So it's almost like it's not addicting in the sort of like common sense of like, yeah, I just felt so fucking good, man. But it's addicting like, yes, I don't have to feel all my self-doubt. I can just do the thing, even if in hindsight it's not as good as it would have been otherwise. You know?
Effectiveness. Yeah. Do you follow the Enneagram at all?
No, it's been circling around me for a long time, but I never chose to dive in.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I use it and enjoy it. I'm just curious what type you are. You might be a 3 like myself with what you just described, which is that kind of achievement driven kind of thing. My wounds are quite similar to yours, is why I think that, or is a possibility. It's that kind of inverse of a feeling of inadequacy or not being good enough. Then like achievement compensates for that. But for me, that drug is very short lived. Like every time I do something where I'm like, yeah, I'm really proud of that piece of work or whatever it is, it lasts for about a week, and then I'm like, okay, what next? Next? So
I want to maybe this is it. Maybe if you're okay with it, the last couple minutes where we were revealing our souls to each other can be a part of the podcast.
I'm up for it. Yeah.
Because I feel like maybe this is a good way to jump in. And that's because this question of how our world technologically has been sort of like designed, how we have sort of like co-designed it with the sort of, you could say, natural scattered sort of development of technologies, handheld technologies and notifications and all the rest, has scattered our ability to make sense, scattered our ability to attend to things deeply, while also introducing a lot of junk information that is junk in the sense that it actually doesn't serve you at all, and then junk in the sense that it's not good for you. Like it's toxic, it's misinformation, it's like disinformation. It's things that ultimately confuse you, and writers like Eric Davis suggest that, objective reality is liquefying away, and there's a disorientation that comes up around this. And if our attentions are disoriented and reality becomes disoriented, our ability to make sense of what's happening in the world becomes disoriented. And so this is why I think it's an endpoint, because I've been following Rebel Wisdom on and off-ish for a few years. But this last year, the Sensemaking stuff has just come along at such a perfect time that I found Rebel Wisdom to very much be sort of like and I know this is in some sense what your team is going for, sort of like a light in the darkness, something to orient to when everything is just crazy. It's like, okay, some people are thinking about it in a way that actually makes sense, both from a this makes sense, but also a sense making happens like this kind of way. So I'm wondering if you can start us off here by giving us a sense, giving us an explanation of what rebel wisdom is doing and what it's responding to.
Yeah, big question. So maybe starting with what we're responding to, because that is consistent, I think, regardless of what it is we're covering or doing at any given time. And I think one way to describe what we're responding to is the crisis of meaning and direction that we're facing as let's say, advanced cultures around the world, and then arguably most cultures around the world. But certainly there is a crisis in meaning. I think there's also a crisis in trust, which speaks to what you're just talking about. In order to make sense of what's going on around us, there are a number of things we have to do. And one of those things is to be able to trust sources of information, institutions, and increasingly that's more and more difficult for many, many, many reasons. And the part of what we're trying to do is trying to, I suppose, over the last 2 years, like diagnose like, why is it? And it's very, very complicated. There's so many different reasons. We've had so many brilliant minds come on and discuss this, and they each bring a piece of the puzzle. And one thing I've noticed is just that the level of complexity is so high that it is certainly impossible for an individual to make sense of it. And this is a point Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's I suppose, a very smart dude and a futurist, I would maybe call him, I think. He makes this point really, really succinctly as well. Like, it's too complex for any individual to make sense of. And so then the inquiry we went on was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's the analogy of like, there's no single person out there who knows how to build a Boeing 747. There's not just like one person walking around with the schematics and you just give them what they need and they'll just build it for you in a month. It takes loads of different people with loads of different skill sets somehow working together. And that's a very human capacity. It's part of what makes us human. I can't remember where I read this, but it was possibly Frans de Waal, who is the animal empathy researcher. It might not have been him, but I think it was a biologist talking about commenting to someone how, using an example of like, oh, two chimpanzees carrying a log together. And the guy was like, no, that would never happen. He was like, no, surely, like two chimpanzees would pick up a log and carry it together. He's like, no, they don't do that. Like, they don't even hunt together properly. They sort of all hunt at the same time. And whichever chimpanzee grabs the monkey they were after, whatever it was, sort of tears it to shreds and doesn't even properly share it. So we are unique in the ability to tap into our collective intelligence together. And that requires an enormous amount of cohesion, trust. And we used to be able to outsource that to some shared meaning, whether that was Christianity or whether it was a belief in Enlightenment values or whatever it might be. Increasingly, that's becoming harder and harder. And so we're kind of exploring why that is and what we might be able to do about it. There's the psychospiritual level of, if we don't have meaning, why do anything at all? Why try and make sense of reality if we don't know who we are, what we're doing, where we're going? So there's that deep core level. And then there's the level of the information ecology of like, how do you figure out what the hell is going on when so much information, like you said, is junk, or intentionally misleading, weaponized information that's designed to for various different actors, state actors or corporate actors, or just individuals to benefit from in some way. And just the quantity of information, like how, like COVID is a great example. It's like, or climate change. It's like, to really delve into it is enormously difficult. To be like, okay, I'm going to have to learn how climate modeling works. Mm-hmm. I'm going to have to learn the different arguments and debates that are going on within the field to figure out what's really going on, what are the best solutions. So we need to be outsourcing our trust in some way. But because that's been kind of so difficult, we're in this kind of conundrum. We're in this world between worlds, basically, where we can't trust the old, institutions, and we don't really have new ones to trust. So I think we're just trying to wade our way through that as best as we can.
And I'm also thinking here about how all this disinformation and all this inability to trust creates a certain disposition in us, which makes it difficult to think deeply about anything, because whether we're conscious of it or not, sort of, there's a core in us that feels disoriented in a fundamental way. And then we're sort of always in fight or flight mode. And so we end up, and I think this is something Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about, that we're sort of like nested in multi-level narrative warfare. And we're walking around with these sort of like this ambiguous, almost desperation for something to make sense. But we lack the cognitive and attentional capacities to sense make individually because of how complex it is, and then collectively because we don't actually have cultures of sense making, and we have this embodied emotional energy that gets triggered and allegiant by things that do make sense, even if the sense that they make is based on circular reasoning and sort of like bad faith arguments and all the rest. And our embodied emotional intelligence gets allegiance to things that become, I think you talk about on the show, the maybe this is the Stoa that says mimetic warfare between mimetic tribes, or I think you talk about it as the culture war or something like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really the. I think I guess a simple way to describe it is like we used to live in a world that was largely polar. So you had, let's say, the USA and the USSR, or you had capitalism and socialism, and you had these two battling ideologies that were in opposition to each other. And that creates for a kind of stability. And when you have what we have now, not just geopolitically, but culturally, we have a multipolar world. So we don't just have, a group of people who are liberal and a group of people who are conservative. That is no longer really the case, or certainly not useful as a descriptor, in my opinion. You have this, and it's Peter Limberg who runs a Stoa, who created this amazing piece of work about mimetic tribes. So looking at, okay, well, what are the tribes? We're broken into different tribes with different ideological, let's say, fixations, different beliefs and values about what will make a better world, and then we are in this battling in this imaginal space of the internet for control of the narrative. And so it is a war zone. Venkatesh Rao is also a really good thinker on this. Wrote a great article, the name of which escapes me, but really talking about how different actors within this culture war basically like galvanize. He calls them mooks. It's like knights and mooks. So you're a knight if you've got like 500,000 people on Twitter, and you're a whatever it is, you're into something, you're in some tribe, right? And you gain money, status, and attention by getting people to have beef with each other. Oh, the internet of beefs, that's what it's called. So by getting people to have beef with each other, so your army of mooks, you generate income for yourself, and you generate status, and you generate attention. And so that is happening on a near constant basis, which is why one of the reasons the traditional social networks are can be such an unpleasant place to be, because they are the battleground. And probably most people don't want to be in that war. You just kind of want to see some cat videos, and you end up getting caught in the crossfire more often than not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and triggered, right? I wonder how much too, like we're like this doing a thing and we think it's fun, and then all of a sudden someone says something that we're angry about. It took me almost 15 minutes to convince myself not to write an angry comment to somebody who wrote a trolling angry comment on my thing, and I ultimately settled on writing him a comment saying that I think that his comment was angry and trolling and it wasn't worth my time, even though I just spent all this time with it and tried to walk away. And it's like, and I know better, but so with all of this, one of the things I want to get to eventually here is to talk about capitalism and how sort of capital, the rise and the growth of the psychedelic industry being sort of met with venture capital and profit-oriented for-profit models for therapy and whatever else is impacting that culture, and what are some of the issues there, sort of taking the frame that you have with Rebel Wisdom and putting it to that question. But I think I have a more general question first, which is, and maybe it's intuitive to the listener, but I would love to hear you specify, where do you see psychedelics fitting into this sort of complex web of problems and potential solutions that we currently find ourselves in? And if possible, if you've got it, I don't want to hear just how they help. Does that make sense? I want to hear your full perspective on where they fit.
Yeah, it's funny you gave that caveat at the end, because I wasn't thinking about how they help, funnily enough. I'd gone into a kind of well, maybe talk about that a bit later, but like I think many of us in the field go through a trajectory of initial hope towards some kind of skepticism of etc. And I think I'm at the tail end of a skeptical journey right now with psychedelics, which have been so instrumental in my life in so many ways. But to answer your question, so I think, okay, there's a few things that psychedelics tend to do. Let's start with where it's unhelpful, because people right now, everyone's talking about how amazing psychedelics are and how they're going to save the world. And they could. I really do think they could. I just think it's going to take work. So one thing psychedelics do is create, they activate our salience network. So salience, seeing what is alive and kind of wants us to pay attention to it in our environment, right? When we take a psychedelic, things become more salient. But as John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto, he points out that he has done a lot of work on the salience landscape and how that relates to how we make meaning in the world and ultimately how we create culture. So it's a big piece of fascinating work, groundbreaking, I would say. He has a phrase which is like, what is salient is not always relevant. And I think that's quite important in terms of psychedelics. Just because something seems like, oh my God, yes, these things connect. Lizard people connects with this, and then this connects with this. And so a lot of what we see in the kind of conspirituality space, I think, is driven, not necessarily created, but driven by the use of substances that put us into a highly salient state where everything is sort of meaningful and connected. But we are very, very prone to making cognitive errors through that. So that's one thing. That doesn't have to be how we approach psychedelics, but I think very often it is, because we aren't really often trained how to navigate the psychedelic space. Arguably, the people who get the best training are the people on the clinical trials. They get good training of how to go in and through, how to navigate. But most of us don't get that training when we're just taking psychedelics for the first time, say. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that, as probably most listeners will be familiar, psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers, and there is debate as to, so meaning, anyone who isn't familiar with that term, is that whatever is there, they dial it up to 11 and they amplify it and they intensify it. That means that whatever our cultural framework is, it doesn't mean psychedelics aren't just going to reset it towards some sort of idealized neo-pagan wonderland where everyone feels deeply connected, etc. They're going to amplify what's there, and the expectations and the narratives we have around the experience are a key part of it. And related to that is or another way to say that comes from Ken Wilber, philosopher Ken Wilber. He talks about, we have states and stages. So we each, as human beings, have stages of development. So I'm not the same person I was when I was 8 years old. I can be sometimes, but usually not. And so when I interpret and then we have states. So dreaming, waking, tripping, these are all states of consciousness, and they have their own sort of rules. They're different. We interpret things differently as we're in them. But we always interpret a state at the stage of development we're at, is his argument. So our cultural stage of development goes into the trip. So I at the same time, I think there's no such thing as like enlightenment. There's a different enlightenment at different stages of development, and whoever we are and where we're at, and what kind of person we are, and etc., what our cultural framework is. So there's all of that complexity with psychedelics, and because of that, like right now, this is the point I want to get to. Like, we do not have a cultural framework with which to interpret the psychedelic experience that makes any sense. Because we were just talking about the crisis in meaning, the difficulty of making sense of this incredibly complex reality, we don't have a sort of mystery school which tells us a kind of gives us a mythic story to interpret the experience and then apply it to our lives. We don't even know what it means to be a human being. Arguably, we've experienced the death of God, so we've lost that kind of foundational core certainty, whether we agree with it or not. It certainly played a very important role. We've lost the role of the church in the culture. We've lost, probably, which is a good thing, the idea of nationalism as being a kind of foundational, this is who I am, this is where I'm going, this is what I live for. And we're in this void. And so when you have a psychedelic experience, I think we are having it in the void. And so we see these things spring up to fill the gap. So we see New Age, the New Age sort of sprung up as like, okay, well, here's a framework that we can interpret it through, which in my opinion is largely bullshit. At largely bypassing, didn't have enough of the shadow side in it. It didn't deal with death directly enough. Then we have Eastern traditions, which have incredible wisdom encoded in them, which I think are very important. But we are psychologically quite different in the West, and we have a different mythic and religious background that forms the grammar of the way we see the world, and we need to acknowledge that to really make something work. So right now, we're in this situation, I think, where, like, what are we doing? Well, what is the culture that we're trying to build, or the culture we're trying to deconstruct? It's a kind of liminal space that we're in. And so with that in mind, psychedelics can potentially help us out of that, or they can embed us further into it. And I think they could really go either way.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I feel very aware of at least your second comment there. I mean, the first as well. I feel very aware of that, and have increasingly recognized unconsciously and then consciously to some degree, that I'm trying to play a role in creating a cultural place for questions, for people to land with their psychedelic experiences in a way that becomes generative to their quest for meaning through how they show up in the world, in the web of relationships of that world that they're in, and includes a waking up element, a cleaning up, growing up element. This is sort of like back reference to Douglas Tatarin, but like makes it somewhere that when the mainstream increasingly catches on, there's a place for them to land that's an established cultural reference point for the development of the culture over time. And I feel like Rebel Wisdom is doing something similar in different ways. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I sort of celebrated your work and its personal meaning for me over the last year. But where do you see psychedelics coming into this situation? I mean, you referenced it just there, but where do you see, and why do you see that they could be really positive contributions to this crisis of meaning, individually as well as culturally?
Yeah. Nice to talk about the positive now. And also, just before I answer that, what just came up for me as you were talking is I was kind of reflecting on what you were saying in terms of the psychedelic community becoming this place that kind of is, let's say, anti-fragile, that's got to kind of like got its shit together as mainstreaming happens. And I really do have faith in a psychedelic community, and I really do love the psychedelic community. Like I would say most of the people who I've known over the last like 10, 15 years in the community, I still have like faith in to like be holding that kind of space, which is really nice actually to reflect on. Like, yeah, people have their shit together. They're like quite critical thinking. The critical thinking capacity is still there. There's some casualties, the kind of conspirituality world and etc. But overall, I'm like, yeah, I think we're holding a decent space. So I just want to say that firstly. Then, yeah, the positives of psychedelics. Yeah, I really do think that Terence McKenna was right in terms of the psychedelics really do show you that culture is not your friend, let's say. Or another way to say it now might be that, I guess, and the way he did say it often, like, the cultural operating system that we have isn't the one we have to have, and that we can actually run multiple operating systems or create new ones. And I think that, as well as that, like the capacity of the psychedelic experience to give us a deep, genuine spiritual connection, which is something we need more than anything right now. I think that is key. And also to burst ideology and propaganda. Like, psychedelics can absolutely pull the rug out of bullshit, out from under bullshit. Like, I remember, like, you know, so much of what we're doing at Rebel Wisdom and so much of what we do in our like retreats as well is basically just following the transformative power of truth. And because in a post-truth world, that's kind of what we need, right? Where we have this insanity in the States, which happily is now over, of a guy in the White House just, well, no, sorry, it's not over. Sorry. It's fine. We can talk about that later as well. But one aspect of it is over, with at least the constant sort of lies, tweeting directly from the seat of power. That at least is hopefully over, unless Biden gets on his Twitter and just has a good run of it. But I think the advent of a post-truth world, which also wasn't just that is a phenomenon that's been happening. It's arguably part of our development, means that coming to truth and knowing what's true, very often just even on the individual level, is absolutely key. And I think psychedelics can really help us tap into that as well. And I think that's how they heal in a lot of ways. It's just, you know, they can be so effective at healing our traumas and our depressions and our anxieties, because they cut to the fucking point. They really get to the point. It's just like, no, this is the truth. This is what's happening. This is what this behavior is doing. This is where this comes from. And I think that, more than anything, is a blessing. It's a blessing, because I don't know anywhere else that does that. You can't get it from a guru. You can't get it from an institution. You can get it from the psychedelic experience in a way that I really think nothing else can give it to us.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, the question of how much truth psychedelics reveal to us is a large and sticky one. I definitely agree that those processes, those encounters, whatever they are truing, in the sense of how you would true a bike wheel, right? And then you got to keep that up afterwards. But I appreciate that, and I am suppressing the urge to talk about American politics, deeply suppressing it. Let's talk about capitalism instead, right? Because they're not related. So then this makes sense as to why, in your mind, psychedelics fits into the larger sort of inquiry, object of inquiry and manner of inquiry by which Rebel Wisdom is sort of exploring the meaning crisis. And recently you put out a video explicitly about, I think it was called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism. And it was exploring, I mean, a sort of very gentle introduction of the history of psychedelics, sort of like legally in the modern world, and then clinical developments and so on. And then you get into some of the discussions around basically what the legalization growth of the industry looks like, and some of the differing opinions on how this industry should be formulated, and what the impact of for-profit models might be, and so on and so forth. Excellent video. I don't want you to try to restate that entire video here. I think it's valuable for people to watch it. But maybe you could give me a sense of why you felt like this specific topic was relevant to make a video about, and how it fits inside of Rebel Wisdom's sort of larger sort of mission, I guess. I don't know, mandate.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's something that a few people who we've kind of had on the channel and been in conversation with have talked about, which is this concept called Game B. So the idea being that if our current civilization and way of doing things, which is kind of a dog eat dog, winner take all, unsustainable kind of race to the bottom, what does Game B look like? What would a new game to play look like? And it came out of a few people. There's Jordan Hall, and Jim Rutt, who was at the Santa Fe Institute, so kind of expert in systems and complexity, and a few other people, Brett Weinstein, a few other people were involved. And it's still sort of a nascent movement, I would argue, and I don't really see myself as like part of the movement. It's just something I'm interested in. I think the conceptualization of a game is really useful and interesting, but I like the reason, or one reason for the film in terms of our wider let's say mandate kind of mission, is that I think psychedelics are a great example of a game B sort of nuanced, care-based, holistic approach that demands that we take into the complexity of the human experience. So they are like a game B thing, right? They are a different paradigm than the one we have. And so we have this different paradigm entering a very fixed system, a medical system which is completely captured by the market, an academic system which is completely captured by the market, a culture which doesn't know where it's going and wants a quick fix for everything, and wants to go to ayahuasca ceremonies and Instagram the whole thing, and all of that. So my question, or like part of my inquiry, was or is like, what happens when that happens, right? Well, and I think I have a concern, because I started out really idealistically thinking, well, it's like a Trojan horse. You bring in this sort of game, this kind of paradigm busting thing into the existing system, through the medicalization, through playing the game, doing all of that. And then the horse opens and you transform the systems it came into. I don't think that anymore. Because I think what happens is that the people in the horse start looking out the window going, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then people say, hey, why don't you join our city instead of coming out and pillaging it? And they go, well, I don't know about that, but maybe. And they're like, well, we got a lot more money than the people who sent you in the horse. So basically what happens is that things get captured. And existing, not just capitalism, but civilization itself co-opts in order to survive. This is a point made by Tyson Yunkaporta, who wrote a great book called Sand Talk, which I highly recommend. He makes that point. It's like, yeah, capitalism captures and co-opts things, like with mindfulness, like with yoga, like with the green movement. And what ends up happening is it becomes transformed into this kind of crappy mimicry of what it was. It gets stripped of its essence and it becomes a performative thing. And I think that, I worry that could happen with psychedelics. And so that's why that was the kind of urge to do the film. And it was actually kind of a struggle to stay in a space of inquiry with it. It actually took me a really long time to make it for that reason, because I kept noticing myself getting kind of like head up and like a little bit angry and pissed off about things, and kind of getting really fixed in my thinking. And I was like, well, that's no good, because that's not a good piece of inquiry. It's not a good piece of filmmaking. It's just like, I've got to figure out. So it was actually a personal journey for me as well of exploring all that stuff, which I don't think I am finished with. I don't think that journey is done, but it's like a section of that process, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, like, I could see, and I respect the fact that you managed to stay very neutral throughout the course of that video, that video that you put out, the film, and even as I was getting agitated, I was like, oh, I want to say things about this. Why, like, it was just so, it was a great sort of like, it was great sort of neutral journalism with a thoughtful angle. And so maybe you'd like to share some of the issues that you felt were coming up now. Like, what are your specific concerns? I'm thinking specifically about Ronan Levy, who you had in there as sort of a representative of how a for-profit model could benefit the psychedelic landscape by incentivizing innovation and incentivizing people to get involved. And that seems like generally the sort of OGs. I mean, that's a gangster reference. It's sort of like the originals, the people who sort of came up when it was uncool, to take psychedelics. Generally, they're not all for-profit models. They see a lot of this issue that you're talking about, how capitalism, so I can't remember the terms you said, but sort of like takes over and then converts it into sort of a hollow performative shell of the once meaningful thing that it was. And so I'm wondering, I guess, what is my question here? What do you think about the introduction of for-profit capitalist models for inside of the psychedelic industry?
Yeah. This is the bit that I wrote and recorded a bunch of stuff around this. I was like, no, it's too much. So it's really great to talk about it. Like it's okay. So the first thing that I think is that it doesn't matter what anyone says, and that we should. I have kind of an extreme view of this. I think we should start from the point that everyone is inherently untrustworthy and looking to cheat. Because if we're going to build a fair system, that's what the founding fathers did in the States. And they created this quite actually astonishing sort of system of checks and balances in the Constitution, which probably needs a bit of an update now because it's a different world. But overall, as I actually think, having researched it a decent amount, I'm like, yeah, this is quite an impressive process of being like, okay, but what if a president does it? Okay, yeah, but what if a judiciary does this? And like, how do you prevent this happening? Basically balancing power. It's balancing the buildup of power excessively into one area. And I think something similar needs to happen with the psychedelic space. And often, like, okay, the issue becomes who decides, which we can revisit because this is a kind of a tricky one. But, I spent a fair amount of time talking with Kat Kanor and Liana at MAPS and a bunch of other people who were doing the North Star Pledge, the ethics pledge. And I went to a bunch of their meetings, and they're aware of the issue. My main issue is, how do you give a pledge teeth? Because a pledge is going to from my perspective, a venture capitalist or someone with a massive budget to be able to spend and lawyers and PR is just going to eat that alive and be like, yeah, we're doing the pledge. And it's almost could do more harm than good, I think.
Right. Because there wouldn't be capacity on behalf of the committee, the society that brings forth the pledge, to do any type of legal action for misrepresentation.
Yeah, exactly. And there's just no consequences to bad actors. And one thing that is unique in the psychedelic community, which I find really frustrating, is the assumption that people who take psychedelics are somehow more kind of woken up or more conscious or more connected than other industries. Like, I've noticed this kind of assumption, not across the board, but there's a general assumption and a general language that, like, people are in it because they want to heal the world in some capacity. And I think that could also be true in some cases, but there's a sort of narcissism involved in, like, oh, I'm a venture capitalist and I just had a big psychedelic experience and now I'm going to change the world. It's like, yeah, we thought we were going to change the world when we first took psychedelics, or many of us did. I certainly did. And I was like 18. I was like, I'm going to, and I went through a process of being like, oh yeah, reality is a lot more complex than that. Like it's so that energy is there and that confuses matters. The other thing is that, yeah, so just to return to this system of checks and balances, I increasingly started to feel, as I was making the film and just like, getting deeper and deeper into this, I was like, why are we talking about something? Why are we talking about encouraging people to be their best selves effectively through a guide when we should embed it in contract law? We should assume that everyone's a bad actor until all of us should assume we're bad actors. And I was doing a talk on this a couple of months ago, and I think what I asked was, is there anyone here who, if they were offered $1 million, would absolutely without hesitation not compromise on their values or integrity? And we all like to think we would be that person. Like, no. Like, so let's say I'm on the board of something like the North Star Pledge, and we have our ethics pledge, and people are doing it, and then someone approaches me and they're like, hey, look, a bunch of people raised issues with our company and our practices. We know you're on the board. If we give you $500,000, could you convince 3 people to kind of give us the green light? It's like, how do you prevent that? How do you prevent that? And you have to assume, all of us have to assume that we are compromisable. This is something about integrating our own shadows. It's like, just because we're in a psychedelic community and we're into kind of consciousness and inner growth and spirituality doesn't mean that we are somehow immune from those dynamics. And so, just to finish this point, the other thing I would really like to see is academia cleaned up in psychedelics. I would like to see, I would really like to know if any academics on the studies have shares in the companies that have been doing the studies, like just who has shares in Compass, for example. I have no idea, but it's quite tricky to see in Companies House, the UK kind of register of companies. It's a little bit tricky to kind of figure out who owns what, and it's quite easy in the UK to do that. So how do we prevent bad incentives in academia? Because we know that happens all the time. And how do we, if we really are serious about doing this with integrity, then I think if someone is in a high profile clinical trial with a for-profit pharma company, that, perhaps they offer to be transparent about their own finances. They really want to put their money where their mouth is. Open your finances. Show how many stocks you have. Show kind of redacted bank statements that prove you're not receiving money. Like, that's the kind of thing that I think would actually embed an integrity into the system. Anything short of that, I'm very worried about.
I think it makes me think now of the Oregon. I think it was Proposition something, the Oregon psilocybin service initiative. And then I'm not sure exactly what it is that they managed to get into law, because I didn't end up following up on it. But if there's some sort of legal thing that is represented in government, if people like the North Star Pledge are not only saying, hey, like, put our badge on your website if you commit to our ethics kind of thing, but they're actually lobbying to have things put into law that say, like, that people must be acting according to these things, or they are subject to consequences on the governmental legal end of things. Where now, because otherwise, if it's just private versus private, it's whoever has the most money wins. And even private versus government is often whoever has the most money wins. And generally, the people with the most money are generally the people who are most likely to be bad actors, because that's how, for the most part, you get a lot of money in our current civilization.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And this is such a tricky thing, right? Because the question is always who decides, right? So it's like, do we want the government regulating psychedelic clinics? Perhaps a medical establishment like the FDA, maybe. I don't know. But what I'd be interested in is, like, look, we're the psychedelic community, right? And have experience and a lot of heart and a lot of intelligence. We should be coming up with a psychedelic answer to this question. One that is, like, different, countercultural, complex, like, tapped into different ways of doing things. Perhaps there's some way of creating a really tight, decentralized system of governance, like a kind of blockchain version of governance that doesn't require a central point. So it's something like that. I'm just riffing right now, and it's not my area of expertise. There's got to be some people, though, like Bennett Zellner, for example, with the pollination approach. He's kind of putting in place and kind of arguing for a certain approach. We need more of those, I think, and people in the community who are just really good at that kind of thing to go, hey, well, here's a way you could make it really anti-fragile. Here's a way you can never reduce all the harm, and you're never going to reduce all the bad actors, but you can certainly get closer than we are now, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you were to ask me, I've answered the question previously and probably much better than I would now, around how I feel about the idea of the government's role in the legalization of psychedelics. But I think that one of the central elements of that whole question you just had is also making them not illegal. so that everybody who has a vested interest in how things unfold get to speak up about it. Because the people who have a lot of money, they can speak up about whatever they want because they're antifragile because they got the money to get away with basically anything that they want to say, but the people who are, say, in it for 30 years and are providing, they can't speak up. There's a lot of people living in places where they don't feel they can speak up because of legal consequences or social consequences. So as long as there's still criminalization, draconian prohibition of psychedelics, and the changing landscape of cultural stigma against psychedelics, then we're not really able to openly have that discussion. And again, this is where I feel like for myself, places like Rebel Wisdom, I really appreciate and respect that you're bringing up the conversation of psychedelics, that we need to be bringing these conversations in a way that asks the real questions, sometimes the tough questions, and also in a way that is representative of how we might collectively solve those questions or figure out what are the best questions that will lead us to some sort of solution. And with that comes another question that I have, which is, having done all these interviews and really having dove into how are sort of major people, cultural leaders, for lack of a better term, how are you seeing the way the manner of discourse around these problems is unfolding? And I'm thinking about this from the sense of looking at the meaning crisis and the culture war and the bad faith arguments and the type of, you're asking yourself, can we come up with a psychedelic answer to this question? And then I ask myself, can we figure out how to be adults when we're having difficult conversations about psychedelics and we disagree about things, even though our key central motive is still the same amongst each other? And I wonder, I'm going off on a rant here. I hope you're tracking this.
That's great. Yeah.
But what did you observe about the manner of discourse on this subject amongst the sort of psychedelic cultural leaders? Does it seem generative, or is it just another iteration of the type of mimetic warfare or the mimetic tribe warfare that Peter Limberg talks about, just inside of the sort of pocket of psychedelia?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I want to return to kind of make this point or explore this. I want to return to a point you made, which is a very interesting one I hadn't actually considered before. Is prohibition effectively then selects for certain people to talk about this and other people not to. Right? That's I had not really considered that point. I think it's a good one. And in the same way, or not the same way, but sort of related to that, is the fact that a lot of people who are that kind of psychedelic cultural leaders now have skin in the game financially in a way that nobody did 15 years ago. No one had, the idea of making money out of psychedelics was insane. It was in fact the opposite. I remember my parents, because I wrote, I was just in last year of college and then going into the working world. So 2008, which was also the financial crash. I had this book about psychedelics out, a novel about psychedelics. And I remember a bunch of people being like, "Oh, dude, are you sure you want to have a novel about psychedelics out when you're trying to find a job? That's the opposite of you were going to make money out of it." And likewise, if I think about the first breaking convention, it was 400 people, and it was very much a case of a feeling people coming out of the woodwork, really oh my god, are we people are sort of wondering, were we going to get busted, or are we going to get SWAT team come in and be look, we got them all together with their drugs, now we're going to bust them. So it has changed so much, and because of that, academics are getting money to consult with multiple pharma companies. People are making their livelihoods out of psychedelics, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing if it's done with integrity. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but we have to recognize that it changes what people feel they can say. It changes how how much they want to rock the boat. And so I've noticed that to a degree. I've noticed a widening gap between what people are saying privately and what they want to say publicly. And I think that is bullshit. I think that is, it happens everywhere. You know, Rupert Sheldrake talks about scientists coming up to him being like, "Oh, I'm really, really deeply religious. I really love what you said." You know, after talks, he says it happens all the time. And he's like, "Yeah, well, you should say it." He's like, no, that's career suicide. I'd never say that out loud. You know, like that. That's it's cowardice. Basically, it is, and that's okay. Sometimes life is difficult, and we have to make a choice between our own deepest held integrity and providing for ourselves and our family. That's a shitty choice to have to make, but it is effectively cowardice not to speak up if you feel something. So that's kind of a harsh way to say it, perhaps, but I've always had that feeling.
I'm going to pause. I want to push back on you on this because a part of me agrees, and another part of me, it's like I feel like if people don't speak up, nothing changes, right? But if the people who not everybody has to be outspoken on a subject, on a taboo subject, to help shift cultural things in a positive direction, especially around psychedelics, because there's a lot of opportunity. I said this in my first book, Decomposing the Shadow. It's like, if you can't talk about these things, you know, we need more people talking about it to destigmatize. But if you can't talk about these things, try to live the lessons in a way that gears people forward. Try to live in a way where people just learn to trust you and learn to trust the way you think and the way you sense make, because you're actually living and applying those lessons. And at some point, when it comes down to it is now officially a public debate that everyone's talking about, your opinion will mean something. And that's not necessarily going to be the case if you sacrifice your entire life's well-being just to make a point, that you sacrifice your ability to feed your kids, for example, or whatever it is. So I appreciate where you're coming from, but I think cowardice is just a little too harsh on the people who are still our allies in this movement, you know?
It also, I agree. And let's contextualize what I'm talking about. Cowardice is too strong a word. I totally grant that. Yeah, maybe a bit carried away. It's more a sense of like, and I'm not talking about like everyone needs to be like a psychedelic revolutionary. I think it's more the case that if people are in positions where they're seeing bad shit happen, at the kind of, this is going to continuously, or like I think increasingly be the case, and we're faced with a position of like, okay, whistleblowing effectively, right? Like, what are we going to see whistleblowers in the space and what it takes to be that whistleblower? And I'm not saying that I am sort of like white knight who, if I were in that situation, I'd definitely whistleblow. I have no idea. Mm-hmm. I might not. There's probably a 50-50 chance depending on what was going on. Like, I really don't know. It depends what's at stake, etc. You know, and it's like not a good position to be in. But as psychedelia becomes more and more wrapped up with capitalism, it's going to become harder and harder for people to do that, I think, because it's the difference between sort of like getting a little bit of money in the space and then like having built your entire career out of it and your mortgage is relying on it. And I think in 5-10 years, I think that increasingly there will be an industry. It's a psychedelic industry, right? And industries tend to then start playing by their own sort of rules and becoming quite circular in their justification for behavior. And it happens really easily. Like, I mean, I used to work in advertising, man. Like you know, that's what I did when I was writing and teaching meditation, which is such a bizarre combination of things. But I really noticed that, like, not a lot of people who work in advertising really like think it's noble. You know, some people really love the creativity of it. But like, it was really rare that you found someone who really thought like, this is a noble thing to be doing. And so people ended up having loads of different sort of coping mechanisms for the cognitive dissonance of it. And I think that could very easily happen in the psychedelic space, where we start to get a situation where things start to go off the rails a bit. And let's say we, for example, have clinics that are clinics that are being run in a poor way, corners are being cut, people feel a little bit like unsure about speaking up. But then what happens because of the cognitive dissonance is that people start going through a process very often of, and I know because I did this myself when I worked in advertising, so I saw it everywhere, of minimizing, of being like, well, it's not that bad because we're going to open 5 more clinics and then more people are going to get helped. And so this is a process that can really slowly drip away at our integrity. And I think We Will Call It Pala is like a beautiful example. That story is like such a beautiful example of how that happens. And I'm very grateful that they wrote that. So that's more my concern, is that if we don't have the courage to speak up now, if we're rewarded by being part of the emerging system, it's become really difficult to do it later. And so it means there is an element of courage in it. Just I'm gonna take a risk. I'm gonna take a risk that maybe this does fuck up my career a little bit, but a bunch of people have in the space. Like a bunch of people have and are doing that. So there's a lot of courage. There's a lot of integrity there. It's just it relies on those people to keep doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you clarifying your thoughts there. Maybe we go back. I think you were tangentially responding to something I had said before the question, which was, how do you see the manner of discourse around the influx of capitalism and its impact on both psychedelic therapy and maybe psychedelic and culture? How is that manner of discourse unfolding between cultural leaders? What does it look like to you? Is it something generative or moving towards generative solution-based thinking, or is it more just mimetic tribal warfare just inside of the pocket of people who are interested in psychedelics, be it for profit or not?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's always some kind of tribal warfare going on in any community. So I think there is a bit of that. And, in the psychedelic community, we have this sort of lots of different tribes of cognitive liberty, and we have people who believe in the corporatization, etc. So that's going on, and I think it's still kind of generative though. I mean, I think there's I've seen some really good talks that people have done, like you're doing great work, getting a range of different people on, like really just like the scope and the breadth of it, I think is good. So I don't think it's as bad as like a like a US political kind of Facebook group argument, right? Like just that kind of like level of it. And I don't think it will get there because we have a shared thing, which is a love for these experiences, medicines, etc. So, and I just remind me of the question, because there was another bit I wanted to get to in it. There was another part of it. It was the
original question.
The one you just asked.
Yeah, the quality of the manner of discourse. Like, is it generative or is it an expression of just the mimetic warfare?
Yeah. So I would say it's still like largely generative. I would say it's a little bit. I don't know. It doesn't have quite as much sort of like. Sexiness and fire as I would have expected, if that makes sense. I just remember the excitement of the community, at least when I came into it, which it had already been like the counterculture had already been going on for ages when I kind of started getting interested in it. And it was cool. It was sort of like edgy and cool and exploratory. And there's something about the conversation which has become a little bit neutered, I think. There's some element of like people not wanting to push the boundaries, which I think I was speaking to before a little bit. And there's like I don't know, there's some of the countercultural spirit is starting to flag, and maybe that's just like a natural thing that happens over time. But I kind of miss it, I miss that energy. And probably the thing that kills the buzz the most is the idea of wellness and well-being. Like that aspect of the conversation, it just makes me like kind of sink inside, because it's so I don't know, like what is wellness, like what's wellness for, right? In a sense, I think it is the kind of right, like it's, for me, the epitome of psychedelic capitalism is encapsulated in like the wellness argument. That was actually the bit of Ronan Levy's section in the film that I don't know if it made it to the final film. But yeah, he talked about wellness at length and Field Trip's plans to kind of get into the psychedelic wellness market. And I really don't feel great about the combination of psychedelic wellness as just a word. Like, people wanting to be more, like, firstly, I don't quite understand what wellness is. I kind of do, but I don't, like, because like I used to, well, I still do, but I used to teach meditation a lot more. And that was like the languaging that we would use in corporates was like, this is well-being. And it always felt very disingenuous, because I was like, well, ultimately your well-being is all of our well-being comes from like a deep exploration into like the guts of what it is to be human, including our mortality and what is the nature of reality. And you're not going to do that in your lunch break before you go back a spreadsheet. Like, it's not real. It's a kind of plaster. It's a Band-Aid on a much deeper issue. And I worry about that, like the combination of psychedelics and wellness, because wellness, I think this is what it is. I'm just kind of working it out as I'm talking. Wellness is, I associate, and I think the word is associated with a kind of palliative care of the condition that we're in. It's like, I associate wellness with like tinkly new age music in a massage parlor. There's not a lot of challenge in wellness, right? And the psychedelic experience is inherently challenging. Like, that is what we know from the studies, that is actually what helps, is having to go into your trauma. Like, probably most people listening to this will know this. Like, this is what, it's a kind of, it's a challenging but ultimately incredibly rewarding experience, like climbing a mountain, rather than like luxuriating in a warm pool somewhere. And wellness is, I think, the wrong word. Transformation might be another word to use, but yeah. So hopefully that answers the question.
I think about. I'm not sure. I kind of feel like I lost the thread that we were going, because I feel excited about where we are. So maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. But I think about, like, I like your comment there about it being palliative, and it makes me think of something Kat Knur said in your video, because it's like the wellness sort of thing is like, do this stuff so that you're not feeling perpetually degraded by the way things are, and you can get back to work, right? So it's like, do yoga so you don't feel like a total piece of shit doing the stuff that brings no meaning to your life, or like, do meditation so that you can not have to feel all the crouching thoughts, bred as a consequence of existing in a world where you are constantly under the influx of unrealistic expectations in your attentional capacities, right? So it's like, and one of the things Kat Knur said, I got a note here. I don't know how good a note it is. I might read it and it sounds ridiculous, but she makes a comment on how the present systems of inequity that we live in is a significant contributor to the diseases psychedelics propose to heal. And if the industries and businesses providing the therapy are extensions of those same systems, that will impact the quality of care and ultimately creates no change. And as much as I have sort of like a slightly adversarial relationship with Symposia, even though I do love that they're talking about stuff that no one else is talking about most of the time, the question that David Nichols brought up in a number of places, which is something along the lines of like, okay, so if we figure out that MDMA cures post-traumatic stress disorder, then do we no longer have to worry about sending soldiers into battle to do these horrible, terrible things to fight our unethical wars, because we got the pill to fix them, right? So then is there, I don't know if this is a question here. Maybe you could parse a question. Maybe you just want to respond about how, if we're not careful, here's the thing. If we're not careful, Stephen Jenkins says the problem with mainstreaming is that you start to shave the edges off whatever the thing is until it fits nicely into the mainstream. And once it fits nicely into the mainstream, it's basically indistinguishable from what it was that you were trying to fight against when it was countercultural, right? And so I'm wondering how much, and I think about this, how much we're mainstreaming ourselves in the process of attempting to mainstream psychedelics, and how will that impact the psychedelic experience that people will have once there's a system in place for them to access it legally and medically. Your thoughts?
Dude, that's a great point. Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought Stephen Jenkinson into it. He's one of my absolute heroes.
He's great,
fantastic. Yeah, he really is. Yeah, I think this is kind of, I think that's really nicely articulated, because this is the Trojan horse point I was kind of trying to make earlier, but said better. Like, yeah, it's that if we, and it kind of points to something else. I think a theme emerging that I'm only just kind of noticing right now is like, there's a question of integrity, and there's a question of being true to ourselves, and true to, a part of that is being true to the weirdness and the countercultural element, and the disagreeability, and the fun, and the all of the things that have made the psychedelic community and culture what it is. And I think absolutely it will change the experience. If the first time someone encounters psychedelics, the only narrative they're hearing is, this is a wellness thing, it's like a flotation tank, and this is ultimately like, even to take it to its extreme, like there's an assumption behind the idea of aspects of the psychological idea that when something comes up for you in a psychedelic experience, that is an aspect of your psyche, taking some form, and to go into it and integrate it. Now, I do believe that's true. It's certainly true for me. I would say that's pretty much how I navigate the psychedelic experience, and it's quite true. But a Shipibo model would be totally different. It would be like, this is a spirit you're going to have to kind of encounter, deal with, negotiate with, or get rid of, or whatever it might be. And those are two very different ontologies. So we're already selecting for a particular ontology right now, which is the Western psychological one, when people are going through clinical trials, because they're not saying, hey, if it starts to get hairy, that's because there's some fucked up spirits in the room, and we're going to do a lot of shit with. We're going to get rid of those.
That's spirits. Because you're being possessed by demons. Resist.
Resist. Yeah. So, and it would only work to do that if there was the kind of cultural embedded thing of like, okay, no worries. Well, I can know how to handle that. That's part of the way I see the world. So of course it would be crazy to do that. And I'm not suggesting we do, but we are just by default always selecting for particular things, and we're selecting for ontologies. Now, I think that's probably super appropriate for the trials, and for people I know, because my wife worked on the Imperial trial. Like, people are in a very vulnerable state, and they need a lot of care and attention. And I think they do a fantastic job in the clinical trials, like taking them through that experience. That guiding is what they need. But if we're talking about people who are like a healthy population, let's say in 5-10 years, coming to psychedelics, and this is a point a few people made in the film, it's like, we need a multitude of narratives that they can explore, and ideally a way to help people explore narratives. To be like, okay, look, here's a real Jungian approach to the psychedelic experience, and a lot of people think this, and this, and this is a way to kind of make sense of it, navigate it. Here are like 5 indigenous approaches that each say something different. Like, it's sensemaking again. It's like psychedelic sensemaking. It's like, okay, wow, okay, which operating system am I going to run? And ideally, I'm kind of running multiple at the same time, that I have a frame of reference where I can go, how interesting. I actually read this thing about this kind of experience, and I wonder if it might be helpful right now to take some wisdom from this tradition, and go, okay, well, this is remember this from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I wonder, things like that. So that plethora of narratives and the flexibility to move between narratives is something I would personally really like to see. And what we get with what we get if we all try and squeeze ourselves into being respectable, materialist, scientific, medically approved versions of psychedelic people, is that we run the risk of losing those narratives. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, because we have quite a diversity of perspective in the wider community. I think there's lots of different approaches, but which, like to your point earlier, which of those perspectives win out? Because a perspective with a lot of money that is allowed to talk about it is currently winning out. Like that perspective, the kind of medicalized well-being kind of angle, the Gwyneth Paltrow effect, so to speak, is currently what the mainstream culture is encountering. And they don't really have so much encounter with the many other narratives that are present.
Mm. Yeah, I'm thinking about Eric Davis and his sort of like talking about the weird, high weirdness. And I'm wondering to myself, I mean, part of me is like, oh, I'm afraid that, because I mean, I personally believe that whether or not it is or is not a total fabrication of my own mind, I have the sense that I'm interacting with the intelligent entity, the intelligence of the psychedelic I'm interacting with. And there's something there to it that can be revealed or obfuscated based on how I approach it. And based on how I approach it and with what I approach it, it will be able to show me things. And then afterwards, whether or not I'll be able to make sense of it, again, a manner of how I've approached it and with what I'm now approaching its impact. And I wonder, like, will we lose something meaningful when those hows and whats are constrained to say, just for sort of like, because it's in the conversation, just a wellness approach? Or is it something more like the reality is that wellness approach isn't going to fit because psychedelics aren't something, it's not a horse that I don't want to use this metaphor. Psychedelics aren't something that we control, it's like, that's the whole essence of it, right? It's like, they're not extensions of our hand. They're not a tool like a hammer's a tool. I don't even think they're tools at all. We can use them as tools, but that doesn't mean that that's what they are. And eventually, whatever we think the reason we're doing it is, weird shit's going to happen. And if your model can't compensate for it, the model's going to change, or that person's going to be left to reel in the consequences of your inability or the system's inability to support them in sense making it. So, yeah. I mean, maybe either or, I don't know. But I'm introducing this thing of like, well, maybe the psychedelics will, by nature of the fact that they're uncontrollable, eventually force systems to change, and we won't go down that wellness route, or not. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point. It's like that's almost a hope and a fear at the same time for me. It's like their unpredictability. It's like, and I really do believe that we can't say which way it's going to go. I wanted to pick up on something you were just saying as well, because I think it points to a really good example of how a cultural framework starts to determine how people experience the psychedelics, right? I've done the guide training for King's College trial that's happening, or sitter training rather than guide, that changes the terminology, which was really good. But what it doesn't include, which I think is major, is the point you were just talking about, which is the third thing, the entity, the teacher, the plant teacher. Because my experience of mushrooms in particular is that I have a student-teacher relationship, which is profound, and I have a deep, deep level of trust with that teacher and an ongoing relationship of learning. Mm-hmm. And it is not me. I mean, arguably it's, okay, whatever, maybe it's me, but not me, as some people say. But it's certainly, experientially, it's not me. The phenomenology of it, for me, at least, in the psychedelic experience, is that I very often have a dialogue. I actually have a lot of question and answer. And, so how, in our current materialist framework, where there is no third thing, there is no divine, there is no mysterium tremendum at the heart of things, there is just matter, right? That is the framework that is being given to people. Nobody says you're going to encounter a profound, wise teacher, and here's how you learn from that teacher. That would be a very different way of doing it. Mm-hmm. Or even doing a kind of 12 steps approach where it's about surrendering to God, surrendering to the divine, like surrendering to this experience, and simultaneously having the kind of sovereignty and agency to move through it. And, you need both. You need both, really. Right now, I think largely the message is, here's what you as an individual need to do. You need to go in and through, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. And this is kind of like, they do a good job of letting people know about the agency side. Like, you can't just sit there passively and expect the psychedelic to work. You're going to have to go into the stuff. You're going to have to be with it. They provide great support on the trials to do that. But the third thing, the entity, gets missed out very often, in the communications at least. Because a lot of the people coming to the trials, at least in the UK, they're not particularly religious, and that would kind of not work for them. So it's not like you need to force it in, but it radically changes the conception, the experience of it, I think. Mm-hmm. It's an open question.
For the last, I don't know, maybe half hour, I've had this metaphor just like coming in and like weaving out, which is like something along the lines of like not veering off too far into the reeds, you know, but also not being afraid to go slightly off the path just to make sure you're still on it in a way. And so I think about, you know, obviously there's politics in science. There's ideological politics in science, especially cognitive neuroscience, and especially more so with psychedelics, given the way in which modern psychedelic science is trying to compensate for the optics of the last phase of psychedelic science, right? And I wonder about like, yeah, you know, and we also don't want to be like, okay, we're only talking about the therapy and the medicine. And so somebody's got to start talking about QAnon, and someone's got to start, which your organization did. And I appreciated your take, but it's like, we also need to be mindful that there's a lot of these places that if we entertain them for too long, they're more confusing than they are generative. But if we end up trying to keep ourselves too tightly into the reeds, that trail is just going to get more and more narrow, and we won't even be able to make sense of the things that were otherwise quintessentially part of the process once we eventually, you know, face them from our narrow perspective. So again, it's a back and forth conversation. That's not a question, but your comments are welcome.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. Like, what's coming up for me is like how it could look for us to sort of veer off, and who we're talking about. Like, I guess, yeah, this is it. Like, I'm trying to picture the people who are going to be coming in to psychedelic experiences over the next like 5-10 years, right? They're going to be sort of like early adopters. And right now it's people who've read like Michael Pollan's book, and they've read the positive press over the last few years. They're possibly open-minded people who are curious. Right now, it's unless they're doing a clinical trial, it's often that they have the money to do it as well. So there's a selection there for a certain level of social privilege and class that people have access to. It's sort of an elite pursuit in some ways. And that also kind of determines a lot of the way people see and interpret it. It's sort of being marketed to the people who generally aren't the culture creators, because the culture creators tend to be the younger people, and very often younger people who aren't in the top socioeconomic class, but are actually kind of trying to deal with the struggles of, a more difficult life. So I'm just curious what it's going to look like if youth culture gets into psychedelics in a big way, the way they did in the late 60s, because you mentioned this thing of like, everyone's trying so hard to be respectable. Like, that's been the mission, myself included, over the really thinking. I've really made it in a way a mission to try and find ways to explain psychedelics to people who are skeptical about them. Like that's part of what I'm. So that's kind of been. And part of that is appearing somewhat respectable while you're doing it, you know? And so that's been like a thing in my mind, like, oh, I better appear respectable. And I know that for a lot of people who are doing PhDs or they're researching, like they also need to appear respectable because they're in the academy, but they're like awesome psychedelic people as well, you know? So it's just like, they're both. And we are all playing this kind of game of appearing respectable, which is fine. Like, we always have to do that. Like, you have to even have to do it if you're going to the supermarket. Like, you gotta at least got to put some clothes on, right?
Right.
So
don't wear your jogging pants to the grocery store. Come on, unless they have pockets, at which point they're probably all right.
Is that acceptable? Yeah.
Well, if they don't have pockets, I mean, like.
Is that a Canadian rule? Like, kind of, that's the benchmark.
No, you know what? It's just like I'm thinking about Adventure Time and Jake the dog talking about sweatpants and them saying that they're called give up on life pants. But then in my mind I'm like, oh, if they got pockets, I mean, like, they're somewhat functional for life.
Yeah, carrying important things around, business papers and whatnot. Yeah. In Ireland, it's pretty common to see people wearing their, or it was when I was in university, at least, like, to see people wearing their pajamas in the corner shop, like, because they had just been like, well, I'll just pop to the shop and get some milk. So, to each their own. But anyway, yeah. So this quest to be respectable was necessary, but it can't go on forever. I think. I mean, we can always be respectable, but I think to your point from earlier, bringing in a little bit of the weirdness, I think, would be good, because we lose something pretty profound. I think if we get too caught up in the respectability aspect of it, we lose a kind of magic, which is hard enough to thrive in certain like corporate or academic environments anyway. So I think that magic needs, I would love for that magic to still be present in the respectability, kind of a flame that never quite goes out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I'm thinking too, and maybe this is what you're speaking to magic, but like the mystery of the thing, both the light and the dark of it all, because some things are magical and twinkly and mysterious, and some stuff is like, staring into the abyss until it stares back at you, like that kind of thing. Maybe just to end us out, I'm like making this question up on the fly. I'm trying to pull this back together. I understand that you were saying that Rebel Wisdom is looking to focus a little bit more on psychedelics in the future. And I'm wondering, maybe you can give the listeners here, because if someone's tuning in here, they either are interested in Rebel Wisdom or they're interested in psychedelics. And so you're doing something that has both. Maybe give us a little taste of what's coming up for psychedelic content on Rebel Wisdom.
Yeah, good question. I'd like to know the answer to that. No, I have a few ideas. One thing I would love to do is get a bunch of people together, like yourself included, like podcasters, people who have platforms, and just start having conversations with us as well. Because often it's people who are hosting the conversations and curating, gather a lot of information. I think that could be really interesting. Another thing I want to do is to do a film exploring the psychedelic far right, which is just like kind of an oxymoron to many people. But Eric Davis sort of mentioned it at the end of when I was talking to him for the rise of psychedelic capitalism. And I was just fascinated. I was like, I didn't know that was a subculture at all. And I think the reason it's interesting to explore that is because it's just kind of strange. B, it links very closely to the kind of stuff we saw at the Capitol building, and that kind of the emergence of new religions online. And I think there's probably a crossover there that can help us make sense of these things, because I think we urgently need to make sense of these things. And also it I think would be interesting because it really does show and dispel some myths about psychedelics that they automatically make you more caring and more conscious and compassionate. It's the point of that we interpret a state at the stage we're at. So, if a neo-Nazi takes psychedelics, they aren't necessarily going to go, oh crap, this is a really hateful, horrible way to be, and I actually really see how I'm connected to everyone. And that might happen, and I'm sure that does, but it can equally embed someone further into something. So looking at the real dark side of it, I think could be really useful. I think it could be really useful for how we move forward. I'm not sure in what way yet, but I just found it fascinating to kind of hear about that. That's kind of a new thing. And so those are the kind of two ideas I have so far, and who knows what else might emerge.
Awesome. So then where can people follow more of what you're doing, Alexander, excuse me? Where can people follow and find out more?
Yeah, so if you just visit our website, rebelwisdom.co.uk, and all our films are there. Also on YouTube is our kind of main channel, and then also my Medium is where I post essays, as you do on Medium. So if you just search Alexander Beiner on Medium, if you're into reading stuff as well, I post stuff there.
Great. Alexander Beiner, thank you for being on Adventures Through the Mind today.
Thanks, James. It was a lot of fun.
And cut. Okay, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the podcast. If you enjoyed it, of course, share it with a friend. And if you would like to contribute financially to the show, you can do so by heading to jamesdavidjesso.com/support or exploring the links that are in the description of this episode. Patreon is the preferred method, but if you are wanting to give a one-time donation, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum are welcome. Furthermore, if you enjoyed what you heard from Alexander in particular, I encourage you to check out The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism on the Rebel Wisdom YouTube channel or on their website. Links to that video are in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com, episode 137, or in the top corner on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube here. Thank you again for listening to the show and listening all the way to the end here. Until the next episode, take care.